And if other people join us during the introduction, that's fine. My name is Jane Edstrom. I'm chair of the National Officials Committee of Athletics Canada, and it's my pleasure this evening to introduce our two presenters. For those of you who had the benefit of attending the visually impaired webinar a week or 10 days ago, Jerry and David were the presenters there. Both are ITOs with WPA. Jerry resides in Denver, Colorado, and David Weicker resides in Qualicum Beach, Canada. And we, as I say, we're very, very fortunate to have their expertise this evening. Before I turn it over to them, though, I would ask everybody to please mute their computers so we don't hear the background noise. I would also ask you to turn your video off so that we can concentrate on the slides, and we will be sure and entertain all of your questions at the end. And we'll give you further instructions at the end as to how that's going to work. But with no further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Jerry Clayton of the United States and David Weicker of Canada for seated throws Paralympics.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Just one small correction. We're going to do the first half of the presentation and then go to some questions on the first half, and then we'll do the second half of the presentation and go to questions on the second half. And in the final question area, you can ask any questions. So just to get started again, Jerry is an ITO and technical delegate, as well as an educator for World Para Athletics. He's from the United States, and I'm in the similar roles as ITO, technical delegate, and educator for World Para Athletics from Canada. So this slide is called educational goals, but it's more informational goals. It's which athletes participate, what equipment they use, what events they compete in, some general conditions, the setup and timing of events, and the judging of events, in particular lifting, which is the most common for seated throwing, and then assistance, what's allowed and what's not allowed, and some unique adaptions for some classes within the seated throwing group. The primary World Para-Athletic rules encompassing this session or relating to seated throwing are Rule 7, assistance, and that's a general one on assistance, and then Rules 34, 35, 36, and 37 specific to seated throwing, and Appendix 1 in the rule book, which relates to the World Para-Athletic implement weights for sport classes. So these are the classifications for all athletics, and they include, as you can see, track classes 31, 32, 33, and 34. And for throwing, it's F 31, 32, 33, 34, and F 51 through 57. We'll talk a little bit about those. And in addition, there are some ambulant throwers. So just to refresh, the 31 to 34 are cerebral palsy seated wheelchair athletes. The 51 to 57 are seated spinal cord injury or functionally similar. They're seated wheelchair athletes in those classes. And then there are also some unique opportunities for some athletes in other classes. So for example, F35 is an ambulant group of CP, and they are eligible to compete, or if they so choose, and we'll describe more of that in slide 30 or 43. And then also the F42 and 43 and 44, which are individuals with leg impairment but ambulant, But if those individuals compete with prosthesis, they're also allowed to compete seated and I think we're going to talk about that in slide 43 as well. The equipment that these athletes use are shot puts weighing from 1 kilogram to 7.26 kilograms, a discus from 750 grams to 2 kilograms. And you'll note the 750 gram with an asterisk. We'll talk about that in just a sec. The javelin, which is 400 grams to 800 grams. And again, the javelin at 400 grams, there's an asterisk. And then club, which is one size fits all, and it has a minimum weight of 397 grams. And all implements are licensed or certified by World Athletics, except those designated by the asterisks. So the 750 gram discus is not one that's used in World Athletics, but it is used for age groups in many places, in many countries. So, and it's definitely used for World Para Athletics. So it's certified by World Para Athletics. Javelin, 400 grams, same thing. And the club is also unique to individuals in World Para Athletics. And you can see a picture of the club there. It looks a bit like a skinny bowling pin. And we'll talk about club throw a little bit later. And it's also rule number 37 in the World Para Athletics rule book. Implements by class. Each athlete is assigned an implement size and weight based on their class, their age, and their gender. And the next slide, this is an example of the implements by weight class or by class. And this only shows the F31 to F38, so the cerebral palsy. So it includes some seated as well as some non-seated throwers. The highlighting of F33 and F34 for shot put male, the reason for highlighting this is the fact that the weights are different, but the implements tend to look the same size, and they tend to, so they could in fact be or look very similar. And so you have to be very careful as a chief judge to ensure that you've got the correct throwing implement for the correct athlete. And F33 and F34 sometimes compete together, so this may happen. And the same thing happens with F36, F37. They may compete together, and they also have a 4 kilogram and a 5 kilogram shot put. And the example that I have is I was technical delegate in Arizona one year, and everybody was cheering quite loudly for a Mexican woman who threw 6 world records in a row, but she was in weight class. She was in the shot, and she was throwing the wrong weight for her weight class. And the chief judge didn't recognize it until I went and I had the weight measured after the first of her world records, that it was the wrong weight. So you have to be very careful when you're using the weights with the athletes. The equipment, so what are called field throwing chairs or throwing chairs, it could be. Minimum dimensions, the height of the seat is 75 centimeters, including the cushion, without the athlete sitting on it. And so, and the seat size can be 30 centimeters by 30 centimeters. It must be minimum 30 centimeters, but it must be square or rectangular. It cannot be round. The orientation of the seat, it must be level or the front higher than the back, i.e. lounge chair position. And interestingly enough, chairs are allowed to have, or throwing frames are allowed to have back cushions and side cushions, as long as they don't impede the view of the officials. And the back and side rest padding can be 5 centimeters. And that does not include the framing. So you can basically see that, as Jerry is indicating, there's a frame there, and the frame is not included in the 5 centimeters. Only the thickness of the padding is 5 centimeters. And you should also be aware that these are measured in the call room by call room officials. They can be remeasured on the field of play by the referee or the chief judge if necessary. And a note here is that often there is a chair measurement session done prior to competition so that errors can be corrected in time for the athlete to compete. This is a picture, I believe, of Toronto in 2015 at the Pan American Games,
I think
where
so.
all of the chairs were in one room for storage. And you can see on the right side, you can see some racing wheelchairs. So they were all in the one location. And for major competitions, a group of ITOs may go up and down the row of chairs and review them all and either tag them as okay or not okay, and then identify problems with those that are not okay that may need to be fixed. Okay. Equipment for field throwing chair. Added tape on the holding bar for F31 to 33 and F51 to 53 allows athletes, or it's also allowed for athletes, so that their non-throwing hand, with or without a glove, may be tied to the holding bar. And this is to provide additional support for the athlete who may be throwing. Their functional limitations may inhibit them or impair their ability to hold on to the holding bar or the vertical bar. And you will also find when you're looking at chairs, sometimes there's a hole in the middle, but the hole in the middle, as you can see here, is so that the strapping can be affixed for the athlete. And the padding on the right, if you're looking at this chair and you're measuring it, you need to measure the height of the padding on the right as part of the throwing chair or the field chair. If it's more than 75 centimeters, then it has to be adjusted so that the athlete can continue to compete. So again, the slot is available. We're also seeing more and more chairs with a support structure on the side, which it limits any potential or a lot of potential for flexing of that bar. The vertical pole is allowed for the purposes of facilitating balance during throwing for all users, but it's important to note that it's not for performance. And the vertical bar must be within 5 degrees of vertical and a single piece of metal that is straight. An angled support is allowed to support the pole, as we just saw in a previous slide, to prevent it from bending. So that's the angled pole or support for the pole. Now, remember that this is 5 degrees of vertical. This has got nothing to do with throwing of the implement or when the athlete is holding it. This is just when you're measuring it in the call room. Some tape is allowed on the pole to allow or to facilitate a grip by the athletes. And some classes, as noted earlier, can tie their hand to the pole and tape it in place so that they get additional support. Again, not performance. So you can see on the image on the left the plus or minus 5 degrees. So that's roughly what it would look like in a call room. And it's got nothing to do with pulling it. The vertical pole must be mounted vertically, plus or minus 5 degrees. Straps used by the athlete to tie themselves to a chair must not be elastic in nature. And you'll see the straps that are being used to secure the athletes in place. And an athlete who is missing one limb, as the image on the right shows, the remaining part of the stump for amputees must comply with the lifting rules. In other words, it may not, that left side of this athlete may not go up in the air, and the stump may not move forward in a forward position, assuming there would be a knee in place. Equipment, again, the vertical pole. You can see the vertical pole and you can see the athlete pulling on it. And we're going to see a video of it right now. So when throwing the implement, the pole must not flex or bend. Is this a foul is the question. And we'll go right to the answer in a second. Yes, it's significant bending of the vertical pole. And this is an example of a typical larger athlete, probably F53 or F54 class, where the athlete is he normally holds the bar quite high, but you can see where the tape is on the top of the bar. But when he was holding it up there, it was flexing way too much. And so this is an athlete who probably now has a throwing frame that has a support piece on it, so it won't significantly bend as it did in this image. The other thing worth noting is that the hand came away from the chin, and in this class of athlete, that's not allowed. So you can see how far away it is right there. And this points out a number of things about judging when we get to that part of the presentation. There's so much to judge when you're watching. So this again is a vertical pole. When throwing the implement, the pole must not flex or bend. You get some language in this one, but it's swearing in Spanish. But what you will see is, we'll show it again, but what happens is the holding bar or the throwing bar is not bending. The whole front of the frame is lifting up, so the whole chair seems to be going back. And this is another example of a fairly big athlete. You can see there are some weights on that throwing platform, and there probably need to be more weights on the front. So is it a foul? And the answer is no. The platform lifts, causing the illusion that the vertical pole is moving or bending. So to fix that, you may need to tell the officials to put more weight on the front. The field chair, all parts of the frame, foot plates, vertical bar, etc., must be inside the vertical plane of the inner rim of the circle. Body parts may project outside the vertical plane. And this is for all athletes in a seated position. And you will note this, it's very similar to, say, in shot put, where an athlete, their foot might go outside the circle, but it doesn't touch. It might swing outside. But in this instance, every part of the throwing frame must be inside the circle, and you can see the circle on the one on the left very easily. And class 31 to 33 and 51 to 53 may wear a glove on their non-throwing hand and tape it to the vertical pole, as is done on the image in the right. And this is, correct me if I'm wrong, Jerry, but it's an American athlete who typically does this. And in this instance, I think he broke his patella. And so his it was a temporary issue,
Yeah,
but it was
he
judged.
broke his leg 3 hours before he performed.
Right.
He had to convince his coach to let him go.
Yeah. Probably had to convince the hospital to let him out quicker than usual too.
No painkillers either, right?
Right. Yep. Okay. So the event process, and I'm just going to describe this quite quickly. There are 5 basic steps. The first is the athlete is called up, receipt of throwing chair or frame. Officials secure the field chair to the throwing platform with guidance from the athlete or the assistant, and there's no time limit for doing this. The athlete is allowed to position and secure themselves on the chair and throw as many warm-ups as they wish in the time allowed for the rules based on the class. So between step 2 and step 3, once the chair is presented to the athlete, if the athlete says, yes, it's fine, then the athlete must get in position to throw, secure themselves, and they may have assistance to do so. The athlete will then throw 3 times or 6 times, depending on the event, and sometimes it's consecutive, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Then the athlete leaves the field chair or throwing chair and leaves the throwing area. So those are the 5 steps in the process, and in a little bit more detail, we'll go through them. Okay, so here's the first one, the receipt of the field chair and securing it to the throwing platform. Note its officials and volunteers will orient the field chair or throwing frame and secure it to the throwing platform or directly to the ground, depending on the competition layout. They may use help from an athlete's assistant if they're allowed an athlete's assistant. So the F31 to 33 and 51 to 54 are allowed an athlete, or allowed an assistant. Chains or cargo straps are typically used, but nothing elastic is allowed to secure the throwing frame to the platform. And it's usually done with guidance from the athlete or the assistant. Sometimes the athlete or the assistant will sit on the chair to facilitate the securement process. And I think we're going to see the next slide is going to have pictures of chains on the right and cargo straps on the left. As long as they're not elastic, the cargo straps can be used or chains are used. And you'll also note that the chains are normally affixed at the top of the throwing frame, as opposed to here, they're just sitting on the bottom right now. They haven't been moved up yet, but they would be secured to the top to provide better positioning and better security for the throwing frame so it won't move too much. The process is the purview, let's just go back just a sec. The process is the purview of the judging team and their volunteers. So quite often there's a securement, equipment securement or tie down team, and they're trained in advance to secure the chairs. And in Canada, we usually there's one guy who comes to virtually all the national championships, and he tends to be the one who helps secure the chairs for all athletes. Assistants, if allowed, and athletes may assist by guiding the positioning of the frame on the platform. So they tend to orient it the way they want to throw it, how they like to throw. The other guide for those who are volunteers who are tying down equipment is that the number of the athlete or the name of the athlete is normally taped to the back side of the chair. So if you see the number on the back of the chair, you know that that's how you would normally or typically want to start the setup process or tie down process for the athlete. So step number 2, we'll now move to. The throwing frame is secure and ready for the athlete. So the chair is secured and it's offered to the athlete. And if the athlete says, yes, it's fine, it's oriented correctly, then the athlete transfers to the seat either on their own or with the help of an assistant, if they're allowed an assistant, and they secure themselves or the assistant secures them, and they have their warm-up throws. And there's a countdown clock that starts once the chair is presented to the athlete and the athlete says yes. And it's either 4 minutes or 5 minutes, depending on the class. And if the athlete sits on the chair during the process of securing the platform, the time for step 3 begins as soon as the chair is securely tied down. The second note identifies that the chief judge should indicate to the timer when to start the clock for this process. Total time is based on the athlete class. And if in doubt, as a judge or chief judge, just consult the ITO or the referee for the event, and they will remind you what's allowed. Number 3, the athlete secures themselves down, takes as many throws as are allowed within the rules. The athlete secures himself, herself to the throwing chair. An assistant, if warranted, may assist in this process. But it's important to note that this assistant is not there to coach. Strapping must only be to the frame and must not be elastic in nature. If an athlete cannot reach an inaccessible strap, however, a volunteer, an NTO, or a chief judge may hand it to them regardless of the class. And we see this sometimes at international competitions where an athlete is in the process of securing themselves and a strap falls down and there's no way they can reach it. So you just use common sense and you help them if need be. You don't help them secure themselves, but you help them by giving them the inaccessible strap. And here's an example where you can see the official on the left side is cautioning the assistant on the right side in the white shirt. He's cautioning the assistant not to coach the athlete while he's securing him in place. Number 4, the athlete begins warm-up throws. If the athlete does not need to do this, he may proceed directly to the competition, or the athlete may take only a few throws and have time left and indicate to the chief judge that he would like to commence the competition. When there are 15 seconds left in the strap or warm-up time, the timer should verbally indicate so and raise a yellow flag. And this is the note that indicates it's 4 minutes for sport classes 32 to 34 and 54 to 57, and it's 5 minutes for sport class 31 and 51 to 53. So those classes are less functional and therefore get a little bit more time. Okay, again, in the process for timing, should an athlete not be ready to compete after the warm-up time expires, the chief judge should begin implementing throw timing, which is 1 minute per throw, while the athlete continues to prepare themselves for competition. Each 1 minute throw time that expires without a throw will be considered a foul. So if an F32 athlete who's got 4 minutes to secure himself without an assistant, an F34, then they would if they can't do it within the 4 minutes, then their time starts for their first throw. And we have actually seen that in some competitions where an athlete doesn't get any throws because they cannot secure themselves to the throwing frame or the field chair. After all allowed throw times are used up, the athlete will be excused from the event. Now, also when they're throwing, they get an extra minute between throw 3 and throw 4 because they're doing consecutive throws. This allows them a little bit more time to relax, have a drink of water or whatever if it's a hot day. And the chief judge may also want to ask the athlete if they're ready to throw, because they don't have to take a full minute. They can start throwing whenever they feel like. Okay, Jerry, flip one more. The athlete is allowed to throw. The athlete will take 6 or 3 throws depending on the process defined by the technical delegate and the meet director, and they'll be in succession without measurement. Sometimes they'll use flags or pins with numbers on them indicating which throw is which. And they're all measured after the 6 consecutive throws or 3 consecutive throws. Note, the athlete must remain seated from the time the implement has been handed to them until the implement has landed. As noted, pins or flags will mark the legal throws within the sector. Upon completion of all throws, the athlete will be allowed to leave. The chair is removed, and each throw, i.e. pin, will be measured with a fiberglass or steel tape as is appropriate, or if they have some form of laser measurement, it can be done either after each throw, which is normally how it works in a major competition like a world championship or the Paralympic Games, but not at all events is there an electronic distance measurement system in place. If the event is held in 2 pools, the time for the athlete to secure themselves to the chair in the final 3 rounds of trials will be 2 minutes for F32 to 34 and F54 to 57, and 3 minutes for the F31 and F51 to 53. And it should be noted that there are no additional warm-up throws allowed. So this would be if you have, say, 10 athletes and you're paring down to 8 for the final 3 throws. They get their first 3 in a separate pool. Then they go to a single throwing sector or area, and they have 2 minutes for their second round to be secured, and then commence their throwing once they've completed the 2 minutes or 3 minutes, depending on their class. So just to summarize, the athlete is called up, the officials secure the field chair or throwing frame to the throwing platform with guidance of the athlete, and there's no time limit for this, but it should be done fairly quickly. The athlete is allowed to position and to secure themselves on the chair and throw as many warm-ups as they wish in the time allowed, as we indicated earlier. The athlete throws 3 times or 6 times, depending on what the TD is identified for the competition. The athlete leaves the throwing chair or field chair and leaves the throwing area, and the measurement can take place. So that's the first part of the presentation. So if you have any questions about any of that, go right ahead.
Hi, this is Lily here. Did you say the chairs are provided for the athletes, or the athletes have to bring their own chairs?
The athlete, at the present time, athletes bring their own throwing frames or chairs, throwing chairs.
Yeah,
There
okay.
There are no community chairs at this time, but World Para Athletics has been investigating a common chair for all athletes because that speeds up the process. If you only have to secure the chair to a throwing area or throwing frame once, then it'll speed up the time quite dramatically by about 7 minutes per athlete, probably.
Yeah, that would be great because it seems quite an ordeal there's so many things you have to do, right? Okay,
Yeah.
thanks, David.
Sometimes you'll also see different athletes from the same club or same country sharing a throwing frame. And where possible, you try and make sure that they throw consecutively.
Right.
And that's just something that you might have to do on the fly. And you will know that because there will be 2 numbers taped to the back of the chair or 2 athlete names taped to the back of the chair.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
Irene
Mr.
has a question.
Okay, Irene.
Just a quick, so the measurements are done all after the throws? So they're not done, like after all the throws are done, not after each throw?
It depends on the competition, but at a world championship or Paralympic Games where they have EDM, also European championships, they will have an EDM set up so they can measure after each throw. But in some smaller competitions, you would use the pin system or a flag system and measure them all after the athlete has left the throwing area. That makes it easier to measure depending on what you're using for measurement.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Other question? No other question?
I was either very boring and everybody's asleep, or I was very thorough. I'm going to go with thorough.
I'm sorry, I'm just waking up, David.
Okay.
Going once, going twice, going 3.
I want to ask a question. Not a
Yeah.
question, but just wondering if you ever seen anybody kind of falling off the chair.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it does happen. It also happens sometimes when an assistant comes out who is incapable of transferring an athlete to a throwing frame from a field, from their day chair to a throwing chair. Sometimes that happens, and they will look to the officials and ask for help, and officials are not allowed to help, nor are volunteers allowed to help. But
Yeah, you just read the next slide, David.
yeah, okay.
Okay, thank you.
That's a great question.
Yep.
Okay, we're continue.
A different talking head.
A different talking head. Absolutely. Thanks very much, David. That was great, for sure. We've mentioned assistance several times now, and the rule of thumb basically is that the more functionally incapable athletes are, they're likely to be allowed to have an assistant. If in seated throws, that assistant's main job is going to be helping them make the transfer from their everyday chair into the throwing frame. The assistants can also help do the strapping that David went through, talking about getting people strapping. The more severely impaired individuals typically have lack of coordination in their upper extremities, and they have a hard time with grasp. So grabbing straps and doing those kinds of things is very difficult, and it winds up taking an extremely long time waiting for them to get strapped in. So assistants are eligible to help. However, officials and volunteers working the event are not supposed to help athletes do the transfer into the throwing chair. Number one, they're not necessarily trained in lifting techniques. We don't want our volunteers and our officials to be hurt. And that's the reason why we allow assistants to be there to support the athletes in the lower numbered classes. However, this doesn't mean that other individuals in the higher level classes, the more functionally capable classes, can't request permission to have an assistant. Those athletes, their requests are evaluated by the medical personnel, and it has to be approved by the technical delegate. The assistants in general, they can help do transfers, they can help guide positioning of the chair, they can even provide fluids to the athletes if the athlete is requesting it and the assistant happens to have his bottle next to him. You as an official could allow the assistant to go in and give the athlete a drink. But absolutely, under no circumstances are you to allow assistants to coach, which you can imagine in international competition. And it's kind of difficult because most people don't speak 4 or 5 different languages and understand everything that's going on in the pit, but you can sometimes tell. So all you do is just politely caution the assistant not to engage the athlete in coaching activities. Sometimes you'll see them hand wave and point to things or touch their shoulder, and you can tell, oh yeah, he's telling him how to move his arm when he's throwing. Those kinds things are not allowed by assistants. It is, as David said, okay for the officials to pick up a strap or an implement for the athlete, but they're not allowed to help do the strapping itself. And this is just common courtesy, common sense. It's hard to imagine an individual, if they dropped a strap on the ground, to have to get out of their field chair and then go over, pick up the strap, and then transfer back up into their field chair. It would take forever. So a little common sense applies here. Judging the event. So as David said earlier, it's a complex thing going on with seated throws. You and your fellow judges are looking at a large collection of things. You're looking at the throwing action. Important not to forget looking at the throw. You're looking at the vertical bar not moving too much. We can't allow that bar to bend during any part of the throwing action. There are a few other technical violations we'll talk about. And then the most important thing for seated throws is the lifting rule, which basically entails you can't stand up on your field chair. You can't come out of contact with the seat. So during the process of strapping the chair to the platform, it is the responsibility, like we said earlier, for the judging team and their volunteers to do this process. Those materials, those straps and those chains belong to the LOC. If they should break during the throw, the athlete has some options. They can get another throw if they want, or if the throw is legal, they can take the throw. So, perhaps the chain broke and he actually threw further than his personal best. He might want to opt to take that throw. That's perfectly allowed. So the chief judge should be aware of that and make sure that they ask the athlete what their decision is for that. No foul occurs because securing the chair is the responsibility of the officials and the volunteers. That's Rule 35.6, tie down failure. If, however, the chains break, securing the athlete to the field chair. So remember, there's 2 parts of the process. One tying the chair to the platform and the other one tying the athlete to the chair. If those chains, well, it wouldn't be chains, probably need to fix that slide. If those straps break, securing the athlete to the field chair, it is the athlete's responsibility. The result will get judged and measured as usual, with no option for a repeat throw. They don't have that options. The rule states that the athlete's equipment is their responsibility, and the athlete's straps and their field chair is their responsibility, which is different from what we just talked, where we're discussing tying the chair to the platform. Okay, one additional point. Imagine that the athlete is sitting in their field chair, they have the implement, they're starting to do the preparatory phase of their throw, or perhaps they're in the throwing phase of the throw, and they come by and they hit one of the straps tying the chair to the throwing frame. If they touch that strap outside that vertical plane of the circle, that is considered a foul. David mentioned it earlier. Sometimes athletes, if they just know it's a crappy throw, it's not their usual fare, able-bodied athletes will tap out, right? Well, this can be the equivalent of tapping out. The athlete will just lean over and touch the strap outside the circle. So be aware of it. It happens occasionally, but if it inadvertently happens, it's still a foul. The hardest part of seated throws is the judging part. Again, I can't emphasize that more. There's a lot going on. The three main elements of importance is, first of all, where does the judge need to be to observe all this stuff? One of the best recommendations I can give to all of you, if you're in a pit like this and you're trying to figure out where you want to put your judges or where you're going to stand, is watch the athlete doing their warm-up. You're going to see all those motions, and you'll be able to kind of evaluate, gee, maybe those guys are almost lifting during their warm-up. I better get over here and watch. Or maybe you see their throw not quite looking correct. You might want to get in good position to be able to watch the throw, especially like during the shot put. Lifting involves the buttocks and the legs being in contact with the surface of the seat during all phases of the throw. This includes the preparatory phases of the throw as well as the throw-in phase. And we'll talk about that in more detail in a minute. But if it either or both of the ischial tuberosities, those bones you sit on, especially when you sit on a hard bar stool, right, it gets a little uncomfortable after a while. Those must remain in contact all the way from there to the back of your leg. And I'll show you a diagram of that here. And also the knees are kind of important, as I'll show you in a minute. The knees are important because they're part of the lifting paradigm. And that is rule 36.1 A and B. And here you go is a diagram of a seated throws athlete. You can see the pelvis here. You can see the ischial tuberosity, or sometimes people will just refer it to as the ischium. Here's the knee. And the rule reads that from this point here, all the way up to the very back of the knee, that must be in contact with the surface of the seat. So if the knee goes forward, it's going to be a problem because then not all of the leg is in contact with the upper surface of the seat. Judging seating positions. Athletes come up with some pretty innovative ways to seat, and they do so for stability. And many athletes have found that straddling a quarter provides them better rotational stability during the throw. You can see two classic examples. The gentleman down the lower right there is straddling two corners. This is more typical to see somebody straddling this corner. The athlete's leg, at least some part of the leg behind the knee, must remain in contact with this edge of the chair at all times from when the athlete is handed the implement until the implement lands out in the sector. So the knee can slide as long as it doesn't break contact with the back of the knee doesn't break contact with the chair here. Here are some videos I hope you'll find useful and instructional here. Here's an athlete, seated throws athlete. I don't remember the class, unfortunately, but watch this video. Watch here. So that is a classic example of a lifting foul. I'll show it to you real quickly again. So this picture is the highest point of his lifting. You can see this is where that bony prominence on his right buttock is. It's way up in the air. That would be a classic lifting foul. Here's another athlete over here. Okay. That was not a lift, and I'll explain why. So this is the athlete before he throws. His buttocks are securely on the surface of the seat. The back of his knees are against the front of the seat right there. He's in good shape. Now, at the very maximum high point during his throw, this is how high the fleshy part of his buttocks come. And that's the approximate position of that bony prominence. So you see that has not elevated at all. All this guy did was, remember years ago, your mom used to tell you to sit up straight at the kitchen table? Well, all this guy did was sit up straight. He did not come up off the seat. Here is a young lady over here throwing the shot put. Watch this. Okay, my question to you is, does this athlete lift? It's a tougher call. Keep what you think is correct in your mind. Yes, the athlete did lift. Remember, I'm talking about you have to have your leg and your posterior on the surface of the seat during the preparatory phase of the throw as well as the throwing phase of the throw. As you can see, during the preparatory phase of the throw, she rotates really hard to the left, putting weight on her right buttock. Consequently, it lifts the left ischium way up in the air. You can see that huge gap. So you'll notice also that this official is kind of looking down here. So that's again one thing we talked about or mentioned. It's good to know where to put yourself. So you would watch this athlete do her warm-ups and you'd have a good idea, oh, there's a lot of movement going on. I kind of see what she's going to do. I'm going to come over here and look and watch them throw. That way I'm in a better position to adequately call fouls. Now, this question is, does this athlete lift? Okay. Play it again. So the answer is no. Again, it was just the fleshy part of the buttock behind the ischium that lifts, not the bony part. Right there. So after all this talk, here's another diagram. This is the diagram you saw earlier. The back of the knee is in contact with the front of the cushion. That means all of this leg is in contact with the surface up to that bony prominence called the ischial tuberosity or the ischium. Now, what happens a lot of time, and you need to be looking for this, is that the back of the knee moves away from the cushion, which means this part of the leg is not in touch with this surface. That is a lifting foul. So not only do you have to watch here, you have to watch here. For one person, it's a little difficult to do it all. I thoroughly admit that. So it's important to be aware of these are the kinds of things that you need to look for when you're watching things.
It's also important that the knee violations tend to happen more often in discus than in shot or javelin, because they tend to be rotating their upper body more.
Absolutely, yeah, most definitely. One thing you have to realize is you can imagine somebody with really baggy sweats coming out and competing, and how difficult that might be to actually see when and if any part of that leg comes off the surface of the seat. Well, you have the right to tape their pants tight to their legs so that you can actually observe for fouls during the throwing process. So many of us will keep a roll of duct tape in our bags or in the pit bucket with all the implements just for that purpose. Okay, this is an example of lifting. This athlete has a shot put in their hand, and we'll play the video. Watch here. Play it again. This is the left leg, left knee. So this is a cut out of the movie here. And what you may notice is that when he rears back in the preparatory phases of the throw and rotates to the right a little bit, he's a right-handed thrower, his left knee moves forward. But then also, as the athlete rotates and begins to propel the implement, the left leg comes back and the right knee moves forward. So even if I was standing on this side, it's easy for me to see that this knee pops out. In a bigger competition, you'd probably have an official over here, an official right here, an official back behind. So you're looking at lifting and you're looking at the knees and you're looking at the bending pole. So it's important to realize this is a part of the whole lifting paradigm. It happens all the time. And the athletes will often look at you and say, no, that's not lifting. Well, unfortunately, their coaches haven't educated them well enough as to what the lifting rule is all about. You'd think they might also be able to put a strap around the front or in their knees to prevent that. Again, probably not good coaching knowledge to be able to help the athlete put them in a position on that chair so they can perform at their best. Now, we mentioned that there are some athletes who are either amputees or at the most functional end of the least functional standing CPs. They have the option to throw seated. Remember, cerebral palsy is a lack of coordination. So you can imagine if you have poor control of your limbs, be they upper or lower, it's going to be difficult you to stabilize yourself and prepare to propel an implement down in sector. So these athletes, the 35s, which are the CP, can become F34s, and they will then suddenly begin following all the rules that the F34s have. F34s are seated wheelchair throwers. So they've come from ambulatory to seated. And for the amputees, it's the same thing. The 42s, 3s, and 4s are the altered function of the lower limbs. They still have their limbs, but they don't function very well. And then the 61s, 2s, 3s, and 4s are those athletes that have had amputations and have a prosthetic limb. They all become an F57. They're ambulatory. They become the highest functioning level seated thrower, that F57 class. Again here, this athlete, an amputee, he has a knee because that's a little bit that's the interface between his leg and the prosthesis. The knee is there. So that knee must be against this front surface of the seat, and his buttocks and leg must stay on the surface, just like every single other seated thrower. The club throw. The club is an interesting device. Its purpose was to provide lower functioning athletes as many events as they could possibly do. So the idea is IPC's goal is to focus on providing good competition for lower functioning athletes. So the club was invented a long time ago. You can see it here. It can be thrown any way you want. There is no rule on how you can throw it, other than you don't want to hit that strap out. Whoops, sorry. You don't want to hit that strap out here during the throw. The legs must follow the seated throwing rules. However, if you see an athlete sliding around and moving around without elevating themselves above the seat, that's perfectly okay. This is a couple of examples of seated throwing. One will be forward and one will be backwards. The first video here. Sideways is pretty common. One thing I'll mention here is this official hands the implement to the athlete. You as a judge should take care with these athletes who have very poor grasp to make sure that they have the implement securely in the hand when you give it to them. Here's another example over here, going backwards. Okay, here's a third example. This athlete is throwing backwards. Again, this angled back is okay. There's a little bit of padding there, but it doesn't exceed that 5 centimeters thickness. You don't count the pole, remember? Let's watch this video. Very spastic CP. Okay. Now, this is a backwards throw. And even when you're throwing backwards, you can still lift. You can see this big gap between her buttocks and the seat. And basically that's because she did the strap appropriately. There should have had a strap here and as well as a strap here to keep her down there because she extends so much when she throws backwards like this. So this still is part of that lifting rule, even if you're throwing backwards. All right, remember part of what we were going to look at today are some unique adaptations to some of the classes. An F32 class is a CP class. It's one of the least functional of the CP classes. They typically have very poor control over their moment. Their upper limbs are terrible, and sometimes their grasp is compromised. So due to these identified limitations in functional movement, we changed the shot put rule. Historically, basically after Rio, we had so many problems and so many athletes could not even make one legal throw. We sat down and said, we've got to fix this. And what we decided to do is we decided to change the shot put rule and only the shot put rule. This allows these athletes to keep similar number of events to their peers in other classes. So for sports class F32, and I'll show you an example here in a minute, the lateral movement of the shot away from the chin or neck during the putty action is allowed. So they can move their hand away from the trim. More than likely, these athletes don't have enough control of their limb when they start to extend their arm during the throw to hold it there anyway. There also is no requirement for the athlete to make a straight, continuous movement of the shot forward, propelling it into the sector. Or in other words, they have a hard time moving in a movement that would be what's called a put. So here's an athlete. Play the video here. At least I think we will. Okay, watch closely. Play it again. So you're the judge and you chose to watch from his throwing side, which I would advise. Oops. So in your mind, is that a foul? Indeed it is, because when I take a clip out of this video, you can see how far behind his shoulder he got. And coming behind the shoulder still isn't allowed. You can come away from the chin, and your motion going forward can be halting and uncoordinated. That's perfectly fine, but you still can't go behind the shoulder. So it's important to remember that for only the F32 class of athletes. Here's another one right here. We'll play the video. Okay. Play it again real quick. Watch up here. Holds it against her chin. What do you think? Is that a foul or no? It is not a foul because during her motion, whoops, my bad. When she was during the preparatory phase of the throw, she's not behind her shoulder, but she's quite a ways away from the chin. That's perfectly okay for this athlete according to the rules. It's sometimes a little weird, but the shot put is one of the few implement throws that there are a lot of rules about how you're supposed to throw the implement. It's not like the club. It's not like the discus. Here's another example. Okay. Is that a foul? Yes, but it's a little harder to call. The shot put goes behind the shoulder, as you can see this. Now, this athlete has a hard time when she extends her arm, keeping the elbow up. So as she pushes forward, her elbow comes down, and it looks like she's baseball pitching. Part of that is because she can, but that's not what the foul is called. She went behind her shoulder. Questions?
I don't have a question. It's just a comment.
Sure.
I thought lifting was only for race walking.
I need to put those race walking videos in here. I forgot. Great.
Thank you.
Uh,
It's great.
Seated throws and judging is a difficult process. It's a big job for the chief judge because he has to understand how to position his judges to adequately watch everything. As you can see, there are so many things to watch for. And remember, we kind of have to watch for throwing and not just all the lifting stuff you need to worry about.
Just a reminder, if you have a question, unmute your computer, identify yourself, and then ask Jerry your question. Any questions?
I did such a perfect job. I'm so pleased.
Oh, just a minute. I can wake up now.
Oh, okay. I have to say, I'm really pleased that everybody that signed in to kind of see this. Had a lot of people look through these slides and make sure we included as much as possible of this. But like everything else, until you've done it a few times and kind of seen occasions where, oh yeah, I remember that slide that Jerry and David talked about. I have to do this. This is how I call this. But if any of you ever have any questions, feel free to contact us at either of these email addresses. We'd be more than happy to discuss things with you and help you clarify your questions.
This is Lily again. I just want to say you, David and Jerry, great job. You speak so clearly.
Thank you.
I really enjoy listening to you guys. Thank you so much.
Well, I appreciate it.
Yeah, you're welcome, Lily. And we'll do a race walk one next.
Yeah, promise.
So we can see some lifting.
Yeah.
Gary, is that your correct email this time?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Making sure. If
Yeah,
people
my-
had a
my
problem
bad.
last time, the email was incorrect.
I don't know what I was thinking.
Anyway, this was
Jerry
a very
was-
useful program because of the illustrations live, so people can actually see exactly what it is, because that's the hardest thing. You can read about it, but until you see it, you can't understand it necessarily. Thank
Well,
you.
thank you very much. We looked long and hard to find videos that would clearly explain some of the things that we were talking about. Believe it or not, some of our ITOs have problems, understanding these things because, you know, in our training, oftentimes we don't have these videos. So hopefully going forward, we can educate more and more people about what's going on with this part of para-athletics.
Will the slide presentation be available? Will Serge send it to us by email?
Yes,
Thank you.
and the video will be also on the Athletic Canada website.
Wonderful.
Perfect.
And James, I think it's you too.
Yes, I was just trying to get a little pause in the action. But on behalf of the National Officials Committee, I'd like to thank Jerry and David for sharing their expertise with us. The slides were fantastic. Your knowledge and experience is fantastic also. And the videos, as someone's already mentioned, were a great illustration because sometimes it's hard to visualize what happened, but you've shown us nicely in those videos. I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us again this evening, and a reminder that on August 31st, which is 1 week from tonight, we have another webinar featuring a technical manager, what they do. So, and later in September, we are for real hosting a walks webinar also. So if you haven't already, please register for the August 31st. Thank you, everyone, and we'll wish you a very good evening.